Okay. You want to just introduce yourself and give us a quick synopsis of how you came into the military or how you ended up in Vietnam?
Sure. I guess it goes back to the 1950s. Uh, Most people aren't around to remember what happened back then on television, but there was a series called West Point, um, and some of you may recall early stars in those series who were played cadets that had a sense of humor and lots of fun and were also sort of devoted to service and had a good sense of themselves. Clint Eastwood was one of the actors on the series, and Steve McQueen was another. So it was a very cool television series. And I guess I was searching about for uh, how to construct a future life. Um, my folks had been divorced, which was kind of unusual in the 50s. And I moved with my mother and younger sister to South Jersey. Um, and I guess the show attracted my attention because I've always remembered it. And it may not have been the principal reason why I was regularly interested in West Point growing up, but it certainly played a role in then and in my memory. And so when I thought about going to college, um, I don't have a recollection of following through on almost any other college application because I was so fixed on my interest in going to West Point. And I was lucky to have sort of improved from my early sort of rebellious childhood so that by the time I graduated from high school, I got the Women's Auxiliary Award for Most Improved in Scholarship and Personality, which means I must have been some kind of an actor of a rebellious sort in my early years. In any event, um, I took the civil service exam for West Point, and I heard from my senator, Harrison Williams, that I didn't do well enough to be considered for his appointment to West Point. Um, and I heard from my congressman, William Cahill, that I'd gotten one of the highest scores in the state. In the end, I got a principal appointment from Congressman Cahill to West Point, and Harrison Williams, the senator, went to jail for securities fraud. Cahill became the governor of New Jersey, and that was my route to West Point. I was also a kind of a troublesome cadet. Um, at West Point, discipline is an important feature of life. Um, and if you varied from the standard, you would get what are called demerits. And if you got too many demerits over the course of a particular month, the only way that you could save yourself from being asked to leave the academy was to walk punishment tours on the area. So that, let's say the maximum you could get for a month was 10 demerits. If you got 12 demerits, you'd get 2 hours on the area, while everybody on a Saturday afternoon was dating or sleeping or doing something else. You'd have to walk the area in full parade regalia after being inspected where they could find more things to give you demerits for. I had, at the end of my 4 years at West Point, 100 hours on the area, which means, or over 100, which means I was a member of the Century Club. There were only 3 or 4 members of my class in the Century Club. And the only thing I could say to defend myself is Eisenhower was also a member of the Century Club. So West Point was a place that was difficult but challenging and fun. And more to the point, I made some of the closest friends I ever had at West Point, and they continue to be friends today. I had my 80th birthday party last month at the Cosmos Club here in Washington, and one of my classmates, Dirk Scow, who was shot down and commanding a Huey in Vietnam with a 50 caliber slug through his leg, is now a CEO of a company in Tucson, Arizona, flew from Tucson to Washington so he could come to my birthday party. So those friendships last a lifetime. Somehow I matured into a fairly aggressive and creative young officer. I went to airborne and ranger schools, and I was also a member of the Glee Club at West Point and the Protestant Chapel Choir. And that meant that I could really belt out a Jody cadence for the airborne troops. And that was an opportunity to sort of take out after the cadre a little bit in some of the Jody cadence language and stories that I would tell as we were marching down the road. If I served in a Russian front, drop me down. I can't remember anymore. It's a long time ago. But in any event...
it was probably not PG rated anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Guaranteed.
Yeah, so at the end of the airborne school, I was put in the first stick of the first plane to jump from our class. I was a platoon leader of one of 5 platoons. I got the enlisted platoon, and I only lost 5 guys out of 100 or so guys in the platoon. And I remember getting in the door of the aircraft, and the jump master said, the standard in an aircraft where you're jumping out of planes is stand up, hook up, shuffle to the door. Well, I shuffled to the door. The jump master says, get in the door, Lieutenant. And as I gave a hard time to the cadre, there I'm standing in the door with my hands outside the door so I could push off. And I'm waiting for the green light to jump. And the jump master says, Lieutenant, I want you to get 10 knee benders. And standing in the door with a parachute on my back and a helmet and a this and a that, getting 10 knee benders was almost impossible. So I got my 9th knee bender, and the green light came on, and he said, go. And I, instead of curling up the way you're supposed to and rolling your head forward and tucking your knees, I just so tired I fell out the door. On graduation, I was called up to be the honor graduate, Outstanding Leadership Award in my airborne class of 750 people. 50 years later, at my West Point reunion, a good friend of mine from the class who I hadn't seen since graduation, Dave Barato, who had become a major general, a commanding general of the 5th Special Forces Group. He was the deputy commander of the Central Command in Tampa, Florida. Quite a soldier. Came up, we hugged each other, and he said, Joe, I've never understood how you got that airborne award away from me. He was the company commander, and I was one of the platoon leaders. 50 years later, he still remembered my getting that airborne award. So that was the beginning of my career in the Army. And then I went to Germany. Actually, I was fairly close to honor graduate in Ranger School, but then I got into some trouble on a blackjack link-up patrol and got me a bad spot report for trying to take care of my troops. And the guy who won the award was a recycled Marine by the name of J.J. Carroll. And when I got to Vietnam, ultimately I was assigned up in I Corps and was on a helicopter and landed on this red hill. And I said, where am I? It's Camp Carroll. And I said, what's that all about? He said, well, there was a Marine by the name of J.J. Carroll who stood on the hill and fired a 50 caliber suppressing fire so that the medevac choppers could take his company off, surrounded by an NVA regiment. And he got a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross or Navy Cross as a Marine. That was J.J. Carroll from my Ranger School. Quite a hero and quite a guy. So, early start, went to Germany, and had met my wife as a result of my classmate who introduced me to his girlfriend working for Senator Morton on Capitol Hill. We visited her office and put the pressure on her to fix us up. And she called her friend working for Senator Russell Long as an intern who had already had a date for the next day, and I needed a date right away because my classmate and I, Mike Leonard, were going to England for Shakespeare's 400th birthday, and we didn't want to cancel our MATS flight, military air transport tickets. So Maylee's in Senator Morton's office said to Linda, "Oh, Linda," and she broke down in tears and said, "Can't you see this guy the next day?" Linda broke her date with an intern working for Senator Keating from New York, and we met the next day. The guy she broke the date with, Brian Fix, also came to my birthday party, my 80th last month. So you pick up friends wherever you can in this life, and they stick with you. So I met Linda there. She was the first Jewish woman I ever met. And that was the difference. This was in July of 1964. And I went off to Ranger School and Airborne School. And I got a letter from Linda sitting in the Senate gallery in August of 1964. And it was a tear-stained letter. And she said, "I'm sitting in the Senate gallery and they're passing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution." That was the beginning of the Vietnam War that summer. Guns and butter crossed. Lyndon Johnson wanted the war on poverty and the Great Society, and instead he got the Vietnam War. And that was the summer it all happened. So Linda, luckily, was going to school in Geneva that year when I was assigned to the 24th Division in Augsburg and Munich, Germany. So we dated over the Alps. And I decided to become Jewish, to marry Linda. And my father disowned me. And it was a difficult period of time for us, but we were certainly a happy young couple together. General Rowney, a West Point graduate, commanded the 24th Division and asked me to be his aide. And I said, "Well, General, I have to go through this process of conversion, and I have to get married to this woman that I love. And I really need a year in Germany because I know you're going to Vietnam." And he said, "Well, I don't know what you're going to do." And I said, "Well, I'll change branches." And he said, "Well, the infantry branch will still own you unless you get a material job. So I'll just order you up from infantry." And we were sort of joking about this in the conversation. And I said, "Well, I'll get a branch material assignment." He said, "Never happened." Well, I changed out of the infantry to intelligence, and I got a branch material assignment to run the Joint Interrogation Center in Nuremberg. And while coming back from conversion in Stuttgart to Munich one night, and my Austin Hilly 3000 had spun over around the bridge and dropped off the bridge and crashed the car and broke my neck. And I ended up in the hospital in a striker frame and recovered from that in time to get married to Linda and move to Nuremberg to take this intelligence job. And so the combination of infantry and intelligence experience that I'd had, I guess, set me up for this job that they assigned me to a year later to go to Vietnam in late '67 as a special assistant to General Westmoreland to handle his special intelligence work and also a back channel. And it was a job that required a lot of hard work and focus and discretion, as well as a security clearance and so forth. And so Linda and I had a year of stabilized tour with my intelligence assignment in Germany. And I went to Vietnam at the end of that year, coming back through Washington for special training on TDY in the Pentagon so I could figure out how to help handle high-level staff work at MACV headquarters in Saigon. So Linda and I got an apartment in Washington, D.C. on Connecticut Avenue. Linda got a job in Saigon so she could be with me, and the Pentagon found out about that. He called me in and said, "Your wife can do whatever she wants, but if she's going to have that job, you're not going to be able to take your job because she'll be subject to capture and you'll be subject to pressure. And so I persuaded Linda to drop that idea. And because of her connection with Senator Long, she got a job on Bobby Kennedy's Indian Committee. I guess it was a subcommittee of some sort. And I said that was a mistake because I'd be in Vietnam and I knew Bobby Kennedy's staff people would be anti-war. And I said, every day you go into the office, they're going to be wondering why you're married to this guy who was either stupid or evil enough to be serving in Vietnam. So she dropped that idea and got a job as an economics officer in the Arms Control Agency in the State Department. And with that, we drove out to Dulles Airport and we got on the plane. My best friend, Mike Leonard, who I'd met Linda with back in 1964 when we were going to see Shakespeare together until I met Linda and I killed that trip. Mike drove us out to the airport, and I remember on the gangplank going up to the aircraft on these contract air carriers they had, turning around to Mike and Linda and putting my thumb up in the air and said, "Vote Rockefeller in '68." I guess I was not all that happy with Vietnam myself, and thinking that President Johnson might be subject to competition from Nelson Rockefeller. It was a pipe dream of all sorts. Anyway,
So when is this? This
is late '67,
December 67.
December '67.
And you're on a plane headed for Vietnam.
I'm on a plane headed to Vietnam, saying goodbye to my wife and having left her behind with Mike. He took her back to our apartment on Connecticut Avenue, dropped her off. She was going to get into her car. We had a secondhand Volkswagen we bought in Germany after I wrecked my Austin Healey. And she was going to drive over to Saks, where she was temporarily working until she got her security clearance. She went to the basement of the apartment building, and the wires for the ignition were all pulled out and draped. Somebody tried to steal the car, and because it was from Germany, not the United States, they couldn't figure out how to wire the ignition. But she was out of a car because here I am going to Vietnam, and she doesn't have a car to use. She had to call Mike back, and they worked it all out. But what a sorry way to send your husband off to Vietnam and come back and try to get your life in order. So I arrived in Vietnam. And it was anytime you enter a war zone for the first time, you don't know what to expect. So you're quite nervous about what the risks are and what you have to watch out for. You have no clue. So we got on this bus from the aircraft in Benoit, USRV headquarters. And gosh, there were bars over the window, and the bus was well guarded. And took us to a place in Saigon down the road where we could sleep overnight, and got an orientation and ended up in MACV headquarters with my predecessor, walking around to meet various people that I'd have to get to know for my job, which required basically a visit to General Westmoreland, the commander of the Military Advisory Command Vietnam, and his deputy, General Creighton Abrams, basically talked to those guys every day about stuff coming over the channels that I especially was responsible for in the bowels of MACV headquarters. Sensitive intelligence and sensitive communications and messages from the Pentagon, General Wheeler as the chairman of the Joint Staff, and Rostow in the White House, and Ellsworth Bunker, the ambassador down the road, and Sullivan in Thailand, and just a lot of communications coming back and forth, and a lot of intelligence of a special nature that had to be protected carefully. So I carried a black bag and got to be fairly well known in the headquarters when I showed up, because after I would show information to General Westmoreland, and we'd chat about it for a little bit. He would write notes and so forth and said, tell so-and-so do this and take this to so-and-so. And so I'd end up dealing with the J3 or the J2 or the J4. And they saw me coming with my notes and my black bag and instructions from the commander. And I got to know these folks fairly well over the course of 6 months. But it was a fairly regular process. In the early days, I had described in a piece that I wrote for the New York Times that one of my colleagues in the office took me downtown in Saigon in early January of '68. And it was like a social occasion. We went to the Continental Hotel, and we were sitting on a table outside under a rolling, swirling fan above us, ordering drinks and looking out at the Ciccolos cycling around in the circle in front of the hotel. And you'd almost not be aware that you were in a war zone, except for occasional explosions in the distance. And we went to a place where we got a massage, and I had a small Vietnamese woman powder my back and walk on it and crack my back with her toes. That's not something you would ordinarily expect to be happening in a hot war. But then I got back to my office, and within a couple of days in early '68, I kept trying to get a hold of my plebe roommate, who was commanding a unit up country. His name was Kirby Wilcox, and I couldn't ever get through. Finally, I got through on one of these hand-cranked phones that they use in the field. I got the first sergeant of my ex-roommate's company, and I said, I'd like to talk to Captain Wilcox. And his response was like a Saturday Night Live skit. Sir, I'm sorry, you're too late. Captain Wilcox tripped a booby trap coming across a stream bed on patrol in Bongson Plain area this morning. His last words were, "Top, come get me." And that really struck me. I mean, I learned that my plebe roommate had died within hours of my call. And boy, did the war ever come home. Kaboom. Just like that. Really sobered me up. And within a few days after that, I was in my BOQ in downtown Saigon. In the middle of the morning, I was hearing explosions, and I went out to the balcony and looked. And there was a gunship firing into a cemetery a couple of blocks away. I mean, this is close-up stuff. And so I was just in my shorts. It was hot, trying to sleep in Saigon. I grabbed my weapon and I went downstairs, and went to the entry to the BOQ, and they had a little guard post there, and a Jeep came by, and we sort of commandeered the Jeep so we'd have communication. We had a bunch of people that we needed to protect in the hotel, and we were trying to communicate to find out what was going on, because there were explosions and gunfire all over the city. But we couldn't get through on the radio that the Jeep had, because I remember, and these are all very vivid memories that don't go away. I remember listening on the radio of the Jeep to this soldier who'd been wounded and was crying for help because he was badly wounded. And he was also saying that, describing enemy troops that are coming toward him. And he wouldn't let go of the push to talk, so we couldn't use the radio. And I don't remember what happened after that. I moved to another location. I mean, to tell you how surprising and thoroughgoing this event was, the embassy, United States Embassy, was a mile or two away from our BOQ. They have pictures of the Viet Cong inside the embassy looking out uh, the night of that attack and that morning. That was the Tet Offensive that erupted all over the country. And it basically marked the end of the war as we knew it. Westmoreland, who I worked for, had been fairly optimistic, testifying before the Congress the previous month, saying it looks like things are starting to go our way, or words to that effect. But after the Tet Offensive, it was basically all over for us. And it's hard to know exactly whether the effect was military or political. I guess if I had to balance it out, I would say the effect of the Tet Offensive was more political than military in terms of actual defeat of enemy forces or victory for the enemy. There was a report that was created by Westmoreland's civilian deputy, Robert Comer, who came out of the CIA. They called him Blowtorch. Comer was a blowtorch, and he was responsible for producing the Hamlet Evaluation System, the HES system. It was a color-coded chart that showed the varying degrees of control we had on hamlet by hamlet basis throughout South Vietnam below the demilitarized zone. And if you took a look at the color coding, you'd have a great deal of confidence that we controlled this area for all day long and all night long. We controlled such and such an area for most of the day, but not some of the night, and so forth. But the colors made you feel as though we were really making progress as you watched the colors advance from a year earlier to current time and so forth. By the time of the Tet Offensive, that Hamlet evaluation system was blown up and never returned. Nobody relied on it anymore. It used to be something that people looked at every day to get a sense of the progress in the war, but it was completely misleading in terms of not predicting what would happen at the Tet Offensive.
Well, and I want to go back for just a second here because you start
Yeah.
off the article in the New York Times with something I think is very important.
Oh,
You mentioned it very briefly, but in putting the Tet Offensive into perspective
yeah.
and why the political effect was so great, I want to just recount the fact that General Westmoreland, at the direction of the president, had been on a train tour throughout the country to a couple of places in the fall of 1967, saying essentially the same thing. The war is all but won. And they were reassuring the American people the progress being made. And I think at one time he said something to the effect of, they are not even able to mount a credible offensive.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
And so then, end of January 1968,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, simultaneous attacks, near simultaneous attacks,
Throughout
a
the
couple
country.
hour period
Yeah.
throughout
Right.
South Vietnam,
Yeah.
that the U.S. and the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, were patrolling, occupying, and other things. And according to this Hamlet evaluation system, thought was safe. All of a sudden, over 100 near simultaneous attacks across the country. Shocked the nation.
Yep.
And you know what came out of that the first week or so, I think it was less than a week, where Walter Cronkite made his famous report.
Yes. Yes.
And that's what really kicked off a lot of things, including President Johnson saying, if I've lost concrete, I've lost the nation.
Yeah. Well, the most specific example of its consequence in Vietnam, and I wasn't aware of the train tour and so forth because we were leaving Germany in the fall of '67, coming back. I had this TDY in the Pentagon. Linda was looking for a job. I was thinking about going to. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to the current political environment. I was preparing to go to war myself. Uh, and so I sort of missed that, and historically I missed it too. I wasn't aware that he had said that about confidence. But not long after the Tet Offensive, Westmoreland uh, called me up to his office one day in an unusual move, um, and he gave me a message. And he said, "I want you to send this to General Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs." He said, "I don't want you to show it to anybody. Don't talk about it." Um, I have a memory that he requested 212,000 more troops, but I think I'm pretty clear it was at least more than 200,000. And I used our back channel capacity and privately sent this message to General Wheeler. Um, and my understanding of the trace of that message is that it went from Wheeler to the new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, uh, who was an impressive lawyer and very close to Lyndon Johnson over the years as an advisor. And Clifford took the message into Johnson and said, "We can't do this." And basically, that was the decision that ended the Vietnam War as we knew it. We were no longer ramping up, we were ramping down. Vietnamization was about to come around the corner. And that happened as a result of Lyndon Johnson's decision to bring General Westmoreland back to Texas. I remember when he was back in Texas, uh, uh, I got an emergency message in the early morning hours, and I woke up General Abrams, and it was all about the siege of the Citadel and Way. And Abrams was such a competent man and such an impressive commander of troops. Basically, marshaled forces himself, took charge, relieved the siege at Way, which was in fact memorialized in a movie called Full Metal Jacket. That was the fight around Way. It's a nasty fight. But the point is, Westmoreland was back in Texas, as I recall, when all that happened, and Abrams was fighting the war. And after that, General Westmoreland was promoted to become the Chief of Staff of the Army and left Vietnam. And General Abrams was appointed to take over as they called him, Comus MacV, Commander U.S. Forces Military Advisory Command, Vietnam.
And when was that?
That was in the spring of 1968. I want to say April, May timeframe. And the timing, I'd have to go back and check the records, but I think it was before Lyndon Johnson gave his great speech to the country in which he declared, "I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party to be your next president." He declined to run for presidency, and he was going to devote himself to winding down Vietnam as best he could. That was what General Abrams' job came to be. Vietnamization, turn it over to the Vietnamese and leave country. We're not going to support a force that was going to break down the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and the war in that sense was dramatically changed. It changed lots of attitudes and lots of minds, but Abrams was an extremely capable guy, and someone we could all have confidence in. And he established, in my mind, an extraordinary principle that I've always thought about. When there had been helicopter gunships that got misdirected in the Cholon section of Saigon and fired upon friendly forces. And I think a couple of political figures, Vietnamese political figures, were wounded and killed in that friendly fire mistake. And I remember Clark Clifford sending a message to General Abrams, excoriating Abrams for command and control of friendly forces so as to avoid this conflagration and this terrible mistake. And I remember Abrams giving me a message back to the Secretary of Defense, writing that he had a son who was wounded in the war, had been over in Thailand. He understood the grave responsibility he had to protect the lives and health of everyone under his command, and that if the Secretary had lost confidence in his ability to command the troops and control the war prosecution, then he could consider that message his resignation on the spot. And Clifford wrote back, taking the offered resignation off the table and expressing confidence in General Abrams and so forth. And it never became a public question that Abrams had offered to resign. But I think about resignations in principle by people who make a difference. And I contrast General Abrams' offer to resign on that situation. And I sadly relate it and compare it to Colin Powell as Secretary of State. When he was brought to the United Nations and had been influenced by Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld to portray weapons of mass destruction as being alive and well in Iraq and providing the basis for a decision to send the troops into Iraq. And I thought to myself that if General Abrams had been in charge in Vietnam and said that he wanted to bomb the industrial facilities, the war-making facilities around Hanoi, to close the port in Haiphong where shipping supplies were arriving, to chase the enemy across the border to the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia, to engage in hot pursuit across the borders. If Abrams had been confronted with those limitations during the hot part of the war before the Tet Offensive, my guess is he might well have tendered his resignation then rather than live with those limitations, saying, I can't win a war under those restrictions. And I think the restrictions, as I understand it historically, and I'm no scholar of the matter, but I think Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, was worried about going over the borders like that because he didn't want to bring China into the war. Much the same as General MacArthur wanted to cross the Yalu in the Korean War, and President Truman didn't want to risk bringing the Chinese into that. So these are all sort of global considerations, but they all matter in the prosecution of a war. And I still remember the high regard I had for General Abrams, who had the strength to stand up and say, if you don't have confidence in the way I'm running this operation, then I resign on the spot. Quite impressive. Anyway, that was the Tet Offensive was the end of the war from the standpoint of aggressive. We're going to win this, and we're going to do whatever it takes to win it. And shortly thereafter, and it was during this time, after the Tet Offensive, and while we were all in a state of uncertainty as to what was going to happen next, that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I remember being in MACV headquarters and hearing about that. And one of the more impressive memories I have of the aftermath of King's assassination was hearing about Bobby Kennedy landing, I think it was in Indianapolis. And he was a real hero to the underprivileged and the black community. He was certainly a progressive Democrat, but someone who had captured the imagination of the country for a large swath of people in America. And when he landed in Indianapolis, he faced the crowd of black people on the day or the night of King's assassination. And he quoted Aeschylus about the pain of loss that drips on the heart drop by drop until you know the awful grace of God. And I thought that was a magnificent statement to make and a heartbreaking one. And it was. After the Tet Offensive and after King's assassination, after Westmoreland had been relieved, after Johnson refused to run, that I submitted my resignation of my commission in the Army. I was going to pursue a different route. It was a very difficult time for a lot of people. And as I prepared to leave to command a unit in I Corps in the Americal Division, I was in the Tan Son Nhut Air Base waiting for a military hop up to Da Nang. And there was a sailor, because Da Nang was a port, in there with me, and he had a transistor radio. And it was very hot, and I remember walking around the waiting area, listening to the transistor radio the sailor had. And I heard, "Kennedy's been shot. He's been shot." And I thought to myself, November 1963, June 1968, what's the connection? Why are they talking about Kennedy's assassination? Because I had been a cadet when President Kennedy was assassinated in November of 63. I had marched in his funeral in 1961. And I went back and I listened more closely. And indeed, it was not John Kennedy. It was Bobby Kennedy. The same Bobby Kennedy who quoted Aeschylus a month or two earlier about the awful grace of God, who was assassinated himself in California as he was emerging as the leading candidate for the Democrats to run against Nixon in 1968. It was a dramatic moment for me and my wife, Linda, because the woman who had introduced us back when Linda was working for Senator Long and Maylees, the woman, was working for Senator Morton, my classmate's girlfriend. Maylees called Linda at 4 o'clock in the morning because she'd been connected with Bobby Kennedy's campaign and was aware that Kennedy had been killed. And Linda never forgot her reaction, because when the phone rings at 4 in the morning and your husband is in Vietnam, all you think of is, oh my God, the Army's calling. My husband's been killed. And it took her a little while to understand that Maylees was calling about Bobby Kennedy's assassination. But she recovered, and took a little while for us to maintain contact again with Maylees after that call. So that was a 6-month period where an enormous amount happened in the life of the country and in our own personal lives. Um, Gosh, I remember now writing about uh, after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Uh, People may not be aware that it was kind of like an insurrection here in Washington among people who lived here. The black community just rose up in a rage, and along the 14th Street corridor and elsewhere, fires erupted. There were machine guns on the lawn of the White House and up and down Connecticut Avenue by the Hilton Hotel. And I got to a Mars operation. That was the overseas telephone connection that you had back to the United States for soldiers. We all had a limited amount of time. There was a big line, people trying to get these Mars calls back. And I got on a Mars call with Linda. And I'd read about the fires in Washington and all the violence taking place here. And I'm in the middle of Saigon and the war in Vietnam. And here she is in the middle of all this conflagration and violence and fires in Connecticut Avenue and the nation's capital. I said, "Are you okay? Is everything okay?" And I said, "Is there anything I can do?" And Linda said, "Yes, come home." And the ham operators that ran the shots of the telephone calls across the Pacific, you could hear them chuckling as she said, "Come home." What a crazy idea that was. So lots happened in that 6 month from sitting in the cafe, the Continental Hotel, and sipping wine under those slow moving fans in the casual atmosphere of a social occasion, to the abrupt learning that my plebe roommate had been killed up country by a booby trap, to the Tet Offensive and all that happened after that, right up to the time when I left for Chulai in June of '68. Those 5 or 6 months were terribly significant to the country and to our lives as well, personal lives, me and Linda.
And you were a captain at that time?
I was a captain at that time, yeah. I had an opportunity when I was in Saigon to write, a letter every couple of days. Gosh, I got up to command a unit in I Corps, and I put my head down and did my job, and I wrote maybe one letter every 2 or 3 weeks. We did get an R&R, rest and recuperation, rest and relaxation. I can't remember what they call it, R&R, in Hawaii. Lynn and I got together there. But, it's funny. It was wonderful to get together, but the idea that you had a week. We went to the Hanalei plantation on the island of Kauai, which many years later was destroyed in a big hurricane. But it was where South Pacific was filmed. So it was a beautiful, idyllic place to be. But at the same time, the idea that you had a week and then you're going back to the war. I mean, it's hard to compute in your mind how to relax and enjoy and still steel yourself to go back for another several months before you could get out. But anyway, I had an unusual assignment with the AmeriCal division. In fact, my hooch with the AmeriCal was only a stone's throw from Colin Powell's hooch. I was a captain, he was a major. And we had occasion to deal with the commanding general of the division, Charles Geddes. Geddes had been the deputy J3 on the Joint Staff before he came to Vietnam to command the division. And the division was a controversial one. I think Geddes' predecessor was General Coster, who became the superintendent at West Point after his command of the AmeriCal division, and then lost that job because while he'd been commanding the AmeriCal division, the My Lai massacre occurred in his area of operation. And that had not been exposed or investigated properly. And as a result, he lost his job as superintendent. And I think he retired. I don't know whether he was lost a star, but his career was ended by the resurrection of My Lai. And so the American television had a very uh, controversial kind of position in all this. Um,
So what was your position in the division?
I commanded a special intelligence unit um, and provided information to the commanding general and his leading brigade commanders. The AmeriCal had been called Task Force Oregon when they landed in southern I Corps, which was a rice paddy area below the mountainous area. It was a very hot Viet Cong controlled area when Task Force Oregon landed there under Westmoreland's command. And it was converted with 3 heavy battalions. The 11th, I can't remember the numbers of the brigades, rather. Can't remember the number of the brigades anymore. One was in Duc Pho, one was in Chu Lai, and one was further north toward Da Nang. But I used to go out and deal with the lower level commanders on a weekly basis and provide them with information, intelligence information about the troops and so forth. Scariest stuff I ever did was get in helicopters. I mean, I didn't mind ground fire. I didn't even mind rocket attacks. What I minded were getting in those helicopters and going out to meet those guys at the brigade command headquarters and out in the field. I once got in a helicopter when during monsoon season, and God, I remember updrafts and downdrafts would take that chopper thousands of feet up and thousands of feet down in seconds. And I remember I had a pretty good voice, I remember from airborne school. I was yelling as loud as I could just to get rid of the nervous energy as that chopper was going up and down and wondering whether I was going to ever land on solid ground again. Those chopper pilots were the toughest guys. They had the toughest job, as far as I'm concerned, of anybody in the war. Going into hot fire zones and so forth. They were a remarkable group of people. I came to represent one of the most dedicated and decorated chopper pilots. He had 3 tours in Vietnam. He was shot down 7 times.
Teams audio.
His name was Shashevsky. And after the war, in a sort of classic way, representing what came to be the signature emotional injury coming out of Vietnam, post-traumatic stress disorder. What he obviously had been doing was recreating the stress situation he found himself in, commanding a helicopter those many times that he was shot down, trying to make sure that he could, in that situation, better control the circumstances. So by this time, I had left the Army, gone to law school with Linda, come out and done a lot of different things, become a partner in a law firm. And I was in Boston at this large law firm saying I'd been asked to represent this Vietnam veteran who was being prosecuted, and I thought that he had a good post-traumatic stress disorder defense. And they said, well, what's he being prosecuted for? And I said, for marijuana smuggling. And they said, oh, so what was he smuggling? And I said, 2,000 pounds of marijuana into Folly Cove. And the table erupted in laughter as they realized the scope of what this guy had been doing. Peter had gotten a boat, and the boat represented his helicopter. And he was going to take this dangerous mission and run it to completion, like he tried to run his helicopters successfully without getting them shot down. Anyway, he had not gotten a particularly good lawyer and was convicted of his offenses. And there was a bifurcated trial where he was sentenced and should have been represented by the use of post-traumatic stress disorder in at least the sentencing part. So I got the federal judge in Boston by writing what we call a Brandeis brief, a long brief on post-traumatic stress disorder. I got the judge in Boston, played by John Lithgow in a movie with John Travolta called Civil Action. But this blue blood Boston judge was very sympathetic to our PTSD brief, and he wrote of an opinion to apply nationally and to the Justice Department in handling all post-conviction matters and prison sentences and so forth, saying post-traumatic stress disorder must be taken into account when you sentence and parole Vietnam veterans who claim this disorder. So it was a successful case in the early 80s that came out of the helicopter experience that Peter Krzyzewski had, and sort of related back to my scary moments flying up and down I-Corps, trying to brief these commanders and give them information that would be helpful to them in their combat operations. So
you arrived with the 23rd in June of 1968.
June of 68, exactly.
And you left Vietnam when?
Well, December 68. You know, the closer you come to leaving, the more you become what we used to call short, meaning less and less time before you're out of there. And you focus very intensely on return to life as you once knew it before the war. And in my case, I had early made reservations on a plane, the only direct flight from the West Coast to the East Coast, from San Francisco International Airport to Dulles Airport. A direct flight leaving in sometime in the morning in San Francisco. And I began to fixate on that flight as my salvation in a way. And I kept thinking about it as a way to get my thoughts out of being in the midst of a war. Let me pause on that for a moment to indicate one more helicopter story, which I wasn't personally involved in, but I learned about later because I got to know Colin Powell from my experience in the AmeriCal and from our work together in the Pentagon and so forth. He had been in a helicopter with our commanding general, Charles Geddes. And that helicopter crashed. And Geddes was trapped in the helicopter. Colin Powell broke his leg or broke his ankle or something and yanked Geddes out of the crashed helicopter. And he got some sort of a medal for that. Things happened to serious people back then. The choppers weren't just for the lieutenants and captains and the troops that were taken into hot zones. They happened to people like General Geddes and Colin Powell, who everybody knows was quite a figure. In any event, leaving Vietnam was a very big deal. And I was trying to figure out how I was going to get down to Saigon when I said goodbye to my unit and people that I'd worked with in the AmeriCal division.
So you started in July.
Yeah, started in July. I got to know the senior staff because of my relationship on these intelligence matters and operational matters that are highly sensitive and so forth. So I knew the assistant division commander, Galloway. And I just saw him at the airport and I said, "I'm going to Saigon, General. Are you going down that way?" And he said he was. And he invited me on his plane. So luckily, I grabbed my bags and jumped on the jet that General Galloway was on and felt myself quite lucky to get that advantage and flew into Saigon and had an overnight in Saigon, and came to the airport the next day, eager to get on that plane and get to San Francisco International and get to my flight. And I'm sitting once again in the Tan Son Nhut waiting area, just like I had when Bobby Kennedy was killed, expecting everything to go according to schedule. And instead, I was told our flight was delayed, and I figured out and was talking to people and determined that sappers, the Viet Cong irregulars, had attacked the airport and were delaying the takeoff of my flight going back to the United States. So I grabbed the sergeant, and we went to the Air Force arms room, and I was talking to the people in charge of the arms because I wanted to get weapons and command a unit and go after the sappers. And I was going to kill every one of those sons of bitches so my plane could take off on time so I wouldn't miss my flight from San Francisco International. I mean, it never got to the point where anything really serious happened, but I was prepared to do anything in my power to get that aircraft off the ground and make my flight. So focused I had been right from the beginning, back in July, weeks earlier when I made the reservation. So fortunately, some other units were able to beat back the sappers, and we were 45 minutes late, loaded on our plane. And we took off. As I had mentioned, these takeoffs and landings by these civilian aircraft were not like things that you know today. I mean, they had like jet-assisted takeoff propulsion. So you took off like a rocket straight up in the air. You didn't sort of amble down the runway and have a slow gliding approach to your altitude. I mean, you just took straight off up in the air as much as they could make it because they wanted to avoid enemy fire. So boom, we're up in the air. We're 45 minutes late. I'm nervous as hell that we're not going to get there in time. So I'm pacing back and forth. I pace back and forth to Guam. We land in Guam and refuel. We take off across the Pacific. I obviously must have slept or done something, but my seatmate was a Special Forces doctor who described this apocryphal tale of being in a foxhole situation where one of his Special Forces troops was thrown in the foxhole. His heart had stopped, and I'll be damned if the doctor didn't open his chest and perform open heart massage and brought him back, and I guess they stretchered him out, and who knows whether it saved his life, but I mean, learning about this kind of stuff is just kind of crazy. That's the way the war was. So me and this Special Forces doctor are flying back together, and he's also going to San Francisco International on a different flight. So we land at Oakland Army Terminal, and again, the 45-minute delay was pretty consistent across the Pacific. And so it was very close to my takeoff time at San Francisco International. I had to get into a cab and move up the freeway as fast as possible. And so the doc and I got our bags, and we were on this conveyor belt, and this sergeant at the end of the line stopped us looking for contraband, looking for souvenirs that people would take from the war zone, weapons and flags and ears. My God, you hear stories of people taking things like that. But I told the doc to go outside and get a cab. I'll take care of the bags. And after he left, the sergeant that was going through the bags, I reached over and I grabbed him by the collar. And I was really intense, and I said, I've got a plane to catch in San Francisco, and I've only got 45 minutes to get there, whatever it was. I said, I really need to go. And he understood the seriousness of what I was telling him. He said, okay, sir, you're cleared. I grabbed our bags, went out. The doc had gotten a cab. I got in the cab. I just gave the cab driver $20 up front, and I said, go as fast as you can to San Francisco International. I've got a plane to catch. So we went up, and it was light rain and kind of grayed out, and sped up the freeway, and we got close to the international airport. And there are a number of exits you can take off the freeway, depending upon what your airline is. And he said, "What airline?" And I looked around, and I said, "Oh, shit. My ticket was in my B4 bag." All I thought about was the flight and not the airline. So I just guessed TWA. That was the first exit off the freeway. So he took the exit. We come up to the terminal. He stops the car. I said, "Open the trunk." I jump out. I grab my B4 bag, pull the ticket out. Thank God it was TWA. So I load up. I gave whatever money I needed to the doc. He was going on to another airline. And I grabbed all my bags with my combat boots and my fatigues, and I ran into the terminal, and I ran to the desk, and as I was running, I got my checkbook out, and I asked for a pen, and I just scribbled across the bottom and ripped the check out, and I said, "Fill in what you need to pay what I need to pay for the flight. My number's on the check. Call my wife in Washington, tell her I made the flight." And I ran down to the gate. And as I was running to the gate, I saw down the ramp that they were closing the door. And in my loudest bellowing voice, I said, "Hold that plane!" And I ran down the ramp. I mean, security was not a question anymore. Like it is today, I never would have made it. But back then, with all these bags around me, I couldn't check my bags. I didn't have the time. I ran down the ramp. Everybody got out of my way. I stood in the front of the aircraft. I dropped my bags, and I was sweating and heaving and nervous and red-eyed with my boots and my garrison cap and I was skinny. I'd lost 30 pounds in Vietnam. I was brown from being out in the jungle, and they closed the door behind me. Woof, woof. And I looked down the aisle of the plane, and there were all these people in civilian clothes with their drinks and their ice and their papers. And they had little screens, little television screens, and they all looked up at me. I must have been some sort of scary image. The stewardesses took my bags up front. I went to my seat. Not a single person said a word to me. No welcome home. They all seemed sort of scared. And I sat down in my seat, and I'd made the plane. And when I got to Dulles Airport, Linda met me and said, "I got this call when I just got out of the shower." It was a woman from the desk at TWA in San Francisco who said, "I think it was your husband came by and he gave me this check and he told me to call this number and say he made the plane." And it's due to land at X time. And I guess there was something about the timing that threw my wife off, and all she had a chance to do was put a towel around her head, get in the car, and get out to the airport so she could make the plane and meet me at the plane. And that was my coming home. And I told that story years later. Gosh, I guess it must have been 10 years later, to a journalist in New York. And at the end of telling the story of my coming home, I heard crying in the corner. I turned around, and there was a woman crying, and I said, "Who's that?" Well, turns out it was the journalist's wife. And I said, "Well, what's wrong?" Her name was Linda Vandevanter, and Linda said she had been a nurse at an evacuation hospital in Vietnam for a year. And boy, they saw some bad stuff in those evac hospitals. They took care of some really hurt guys. And if she did that for a year, you can imagine what she went through, and she was crying, and she said, "I did that for a year, and I've never talked about it until I heard your story." And after that, she wrote a book called Home Before Morning. And that book became the basis for the television series China Beach, which starred Kim Delaney. And it was about an R&R location south of Da Nang in I-Corps, a place called China Beach that I never saw when I was up in Chulai, up in I-Corps. But those stories of coming home can really make a difference. The same day that I told the story to the journalist taking a recording, my friend who got me up to New York to do this stuff, Bobby Muller, in a wheelchair, he'd been shot in the chest. Lucky to survive. There was a medevac chopper on station when he was shot, and they took him to a hospital ship steaming off the South China Sea, and they saved his life. And so we became friends and did a lot of work to try to help Vietnam veterans. Bobby took me to, I think it was WAMU, talk radio. And I got into one of these quiet sound booths, on air. A guy like yourself was asking me questions. I told him this story. I finished the story of my coming home. And I sort of sighed again, having told the story. And I said, I don't know what people think about that. And he said, I'll tell you what. He said, look over there. And we got up. And he said, look through there. And there was a bank, one of these big phones with buttons on it, 10 across and 10 down. And every button on the phone bank was blinking. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Because all the veterans, like Linda Vandevanter, had heard my story on the radio and were calling in, and they wanted to tell their stories. It was just amazing how one person can tell a story and can wake all sorts of other people up who had never felt free before to talk about their experience. And that was sort of the story of coming back from Vietnam for veterans throughout the country. So many never had a chance to tell their stories or never were asked, like when I got in that plane and dropped my bags and walked back to my seat. Nobody ever said, welcome home, or how are you doing, or where have you been, and what was it like? But, when a veteran talks to a veteran, things can happen, and it can make a difference. So I guess that sort of covers some highlights of why I got in the Army and how I ended up in Vietnam and what it was like afterward.
One of the things I do want to spend a couple of minutes talking about
sure.
is while you were at the Pentagon,
Mm-hmm.
the effort to build the Vietnam Veterans Memorial
Oh, yes.
was ongoing.
Sure.
Okay, and at one point when they were running the design competition,
Mm-hmm.
they needed a little bit of help.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your involvement?
Oh,
and
sure,
what happened
yeah.
with that and the building of the wall?
Sure. Well, it turned out at the same time, and I had described this period of time in the 70s like the Wild West of Vietnam veteran activity. Bobby Muller and I were invited on the Today Show with Tom Brokaw, and Bobby sort of gave up his spot and said, why don't we invite John Kerry, who at the time was at a low point. He'd been sort of the leader of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. We invited John on the show. And so John and I talked to Tom Brokaw for half an hour on the Today Show back in 1978, 79, something like that. But those are the kind of things that happened back then. All the active Vietnam veterans got to know each other. I knew Ron Kovic, born on the 4th of July. He was another wheelchair veteran like Bobby. Uh, I knew Max Cleland, who was close to Jimmy Carter. Max had been his Secretary of State in Georgia, became the head of the VA. Anyway, as part of all that, veterans get to know each other. One guy that got to know me and followed me from West Point into law school a few years later was Jack Wheeler, who became the chairman of the board of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. And Jack knew a guy called Jan Scruggs, like I knew a guy called Bobby Muller. And out of Bobby Muller came Vietnam Veterans of America, and out of Jan Scruggs came the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So, as a lawyer in a law firm, I was representing a bank loaning money to the Eisenhower Center, and I went over to one of our closing meetings for the loan, and I met a junior lawyer on the other side of the table by the name of Bob Dubeck. And when I was meeting with Jan and Jack Wheeler, who came to apply to my law firm, and so we were colleagues in my law firm, I said we should invite in Bob Dubeck. And in the end, it was those three guys that sort of made the memorial at the outset in the 70s. Jack was the chairman, Jan was the president, and Bob was the project director. And these were the guys that put it all together. So we got to know each other. On the one side, I got to know Bobby Muller and all those activists, like John Kerry. And on the other side, I got to know Jan and Jack and Bob Dubeck. And one of the events that Bobby and I went to, we got to know Phil Jalen, who ran the op-ed page on the Washington Post. Jalen was a Marine, and he invited me and Bobby up to New York to a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations. The president then was Win Lord, who became Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, East Asia. His wife is the author Betty Ballard. So Phil Jalen and Win Lord at the council sponsored this get-together with me and Bobby Muller. And Melvin Laird, the former Secretary of Defense, was there. Just a whole lot of people. A senior vice president from Exxon. I forget the name of the guy. The head of Time Life magazine. He's an Austrian guy, had a heavy Austrian accent. But we made a pitch to these people to help Vietnam veterans. And one of the people there was Mac Bundy. Mac had been Kennedy's national security advisor and was the president of the Ford Foundation. So we talked to Bundy and wanted to get money out of Bundy for Vietnam veterans. I'm getting around to the story. So Bobby and I made a separate meeting to go to the Ford Foundation and meet with Mac Bundy. He's a very smart guy. McGeorge Bundy is his more formal name. The Ford Foundation is a beautiful building, brick building, and they have this great atrium, lots of light and air and green plants and stuff. And we go up to the top floor to the president's office, and we're in there talking to him. You know, we're just kids. You know, we're in our 30s, and these guys have had a life, dealing with presidents and whatnot. Here we are, sort of scrambling around trying to help Vietnam veterans. And we're chatting with Bundy, and he said, "Okay, we had trouble with the Ford Foundation because the nonprofit area, nonprofit groups where they were doing the funding, they were all anti-war, and they weren't going to give us a nickel. So we came to Bundy, and he said, well, I have discretionary funds, and I'll give you $25,000 out of my discretionary fund. Now, in 1970s, that's a lot of money. But he said, so who do I give it to? So we said this Council of Vietnam Veterans, which is the name that I gave the organization, became Vietnam Veterans of America. He said, well, what kind of an organization is that? And I said, it's a 501c19. He said, what's that? And I said, it's a nonprofit organization. It takes deductible contributions. So he pushes a button on his phone. He gets the general counsel of the Ford Foundation. He said, come up here and tell me what a C19 is. I mean, just like that. So the general counsel pops up and they start talking about nonprofits and so forth. And I went back to Washington. And I had been enough of an activist that I'd written a paper about all the anti-war people that the Carter administration had hired at Senate confirmation levels. And I was disturbed by that. I mean, they ought to be respectful of people that serve, and why are all these anti-war people getting the nod? That got some attention. Bernie Weinraub had been a war correspondent for the New York Times. And he read my paper, and we had a meeting, and he talked to Bobby, and he ended up writing an article in the 70s for the New York Times magazine about veterans who finally find their voice. And we were going to have the cover of the New York Times magazine, except the Pope decided to visit Yankee Stadium. So we lost the cover to the Pope. But we still had a nice article. I had a nice picture with our older son, Jason, in it. Bobby had a picture. There was another veteran, Dave Christian, who was a very highly decorated, heroic guy. And in that article, I was described as being critical of the Carter administration. So somehow that word got around. And a good friend of mine in practice of law had become the Undersecretary of the Navy, Jim Woolsey. Jim ultimately became director of the CIA under Clinton. Woolsey said there was a spot opening up in the Air Force as assistant secretary that I might be interested in. So I said, sure. Jim and I had sort of grown up age-wise together, but he had took a different route. He'd been a Rhodes Scholar, and then he went to Yale Law School, and then when I was in Vietnam working for Westmoreland, he was in the Pentagon working on arms control. What the heck was the name of that famous arms control guy? This is what happens when you turn 80. You lose a few facts here and there. But in any event, he stayed back here and worked for this guy in arms control, very famous fellow that I'll try to remember, and then became the general counsel to the Senate Armed Services Committee under famous Mississippi senator. So Jim was well connected, but had never actually served in the war. But he'd been in the uniform, so he was sympathetic to the veteran stuff. Anyway, I ended up getting this job in the Air Force as Assistant Secretary for Manpower, Reserve Affairs, and Installations. And I was to start that job not long after our meeting with Mac Bundy. And I never got the check from Mac Bundy. I did get a call from Pat Moynihan at our home after he read the article in the New York Times. He was a senator from New York at the time. Linda picked up the phone and he said, "This is Pat Moynihan. Is Joe Zengerle there?" She said, "Yeah, I'm the Queen of England." She hung up the phone. And he called back and he said, "I don't know who it was that answered your phone, but your housekeeper has a smart mouth on her." He was inviting me up to have a scotch. He was a famous guy for having drinks with people. Stuff happened. Susan Mellon, who had funded the Bach Mai Hospital in Hanoi during the war, read the article, and she asked to visit me in my law office. And she came in with her lawyer, and she sat there and listened to me about Vietnam veterans and wrote out a check for $25,000 and said, "Here, and I don't ever want to hear from you again." So I took the But by the time I went into the Pentagon as assistant secretary, we'd not gotten any money from Mac Bundy, and I was really pissed because we'd had the meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations. We'd gone to his office. He called his general counsel up to learn about 501c19 organization, blah, blah, blah. So I said something to somebody, and I got a call at the Pentagon from Frank Thomas, who was the new president of the Ford Foundation. He'd come out of Bedford-Stuyvesant. He said, I understand that you're angry at the Ford Foundation. I said, you're absolutely right. Mac Bundy said he'd send us $25,000 from his discretionary fund. We were having trouble getting it out of your nonprofit organization because they're all anti-war. So he said, well, Joe, I'm putting a $25,000 check into FedEx and you'll have it by tomorrow for Vietnam veterans. So that was my kickoff as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. And that was more or less involved with Bobby Mueller, but I'd known, Jack Wheeler and Jan Scruggs, and I introduced Bob Dubeck. I'm sitting in my office in the Pentagon, and Jan Scruggs called. And I said, what's up, Jan? And he said, well, we've got a problem. I said, what's that? And he said, we're running a design competition for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and we've got something like 1,400 design entries. It'll be the biggest architectural competition in history. And I don't know what to do with it. And I said, well, I don't either, but let me think about it. So I hung up the phone, I thought about it, and I called my military assistant in. And he'd been the base commander at Dover Air Force Base, which takes all the casualties that come in and so forth. Dover's a fairly famous place. And we talked about it. And I said, these hangars are really big. Maybe we could do it in a hangar at Andrews Air Force Base, which is the biggest, air base around Washington. And he said, sure, let's try to work that out. So we proposed the idea. I called Jan back and said, I'm going to try to get you a hangar for the design competition. And we floated the idea, and there was a brigadier general in charge of the base commander at Andrews Air Force Base who got back. And, it was the Carter administration, and a lot of people in the military are conservative. They're all waiting you could see it happen with Ronald Reagan when he came in. And so the whole atmosphere in a Carter administration, a Democratic administration, is a little different because of all I had complained myself about all of the anti-war activists that had been identified, appointed. So I think there was a sense among senior people in the military that maybe Carter wasn't their best friend and his people weren't. But, I'm a Vietnam veteran. I'm their friend. But this guy came back to me, and you know what the slow roll is like. They can not respond to you right away, and eventually you'll go away because you're not going to get what you want. Well, this general gave me the runaround about getting a hangar at Andrews Air Force Base because he said it's a security problem. I mean, if you're going to have a design competition, people are going to want to come in and see it. They're going to have to be passes and security guards and blah, blah, blah. So I said, let me think about it. So I hung up, thought about it, and told my base commander, I said, I'm coming back to him and I'm going to tell him that he can run that design competition at Andrews Air Force Base hangar on Memorial Day weekend when it's open to the public. And if he's got a security problem then, he's going to have to shut Andrews Air Force Base down entirely because that's when they're allowed to roam free on the base. Can't be a security problem then. And that was the deal. That was the deal closer. So we called back and I ordered the hangar to be made available and told Jan about it. And as a result, that's where the design competition was held. That's where all the judges sort of walked around for 3 days on the weekend. And they came up with, I don't think it was unanimous, but it was a pretty strong consensus that Maya Lin's design ought to be chosen. And you've probably watched the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Well, in chapter 6 or 7 or something like that, there's a plane that flies over the hangar at Andrews Air Force Base, and the voiceover says, and that's where the design competition was held for the Vietnam Veteran Memorial. Mm-hmm. And that was my hangar.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
and,
that's
and it was unanimous. The last judging.
was it
The last round of
unanimous?
Judging.
I remember there were a lot of judges on that
There were 8
committee.
of them,
8, yeah,
and it was unanimous,
unanimous.
and it was blind.
Yeah, oh yeah. So
blind
nobody knew.
competition.
Yeah, right.
So once they chose the design, they opened the envelope on the back, and that's where they got the surprise
Oh,
of
is
their
that?
lives.
Oh, is that right? No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, it's such a knockout thing. I mean, in 1982, uh, when the memorial was dedicated, is that the right word?
Mm-hmm.
When it was dedicated, I was standing at the apex with all these people milling around, and I got a picture taken with Maya Lin for the design. It was really, my kids have it, and I'm very proud of it. It's
that's
really a
cool.
nice thing to have.